So we're ready to start with the next session. Our first speaker is Xiaohan Liu on behalf of Scott Hauck's group. I think you can go ahead and start.
Hello. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Xiaohan Liu, and I'm from Scott Hauck's group here in the UW. We work with, can everyone hear me okay? Okay, this sounds better. Okay. So yeah, we work with Shicha's group, Boch's group, Amy's group, and Ali's group on the A3D3 related projects. So I will talk about my project first, and then I will also introduce other related projects as well at the end. So my project is sleep spindles as a driver of low latency, low power machine learning in HL/ML. So let's start with what we do. So basically, in short, we deploy models, algorithms onto FPGA to allow fast data processing, low latency data processing. And this low latency machine learning can be used in different areas, directions, applications. But for this specific project and related projects, we are trying to deploy models that are used for processing neuron data to help neuroscientists to understand specific neuron signals. So the specific neuron signal is called sleep spindle. It is an oscillating brainwave signal that occurs primarily during sleep or rest, and it is believed to contribute to learn. So which means that if we disturb a sleep spindle, the subject will probably not able to learn a specific movement or behavior. And yeah, that's a sleep spindle. And our goal here is try to predict the spindle will occur and shut it off from or prevent it from happening. So yeah, so we will definitely need some hardware to record brainwaves. That's a head-mounted device from Amy's lab, and it consists of electrodes, amplifier, adapter, head stages, and this will be put on the subject's skull. And in our case, the subject will be monkey. And then, okay, here we go. So, and then this small stuff will be connected with the FPGA. And in this case, the FPGA can read signal from the brain and can also send stimulation back to the subject. Yeah, so in this case, if we disturb a spindle, we will have to control the experiment, one with spindle, one without spindle. And we hope that we can help neuroscientists to understand the theory behind this. Yeah, so the FPGA will contain a model, or the model will be deployed onto the FPGA. So the model is called latent factor analysis via dynamical system. So you probably see this model several times today. And let's just take a look at the overall architecture, and I will show a more detailed architecture later. So basically, this is a RNN variational autoencoder. The input spiking data will be sent into the encoder and goes to the sampling generator or the decoder, the same thing, and goes to a dense layer that to generate the first important output of alphas, which is called generally called alphas factor. So factor is a set of low dimensional values that can explain the input spiking data train. And also this factor will be sent into another dense layer to generate the second important output of alphas, which is the log firing rates. And those log firing rates are correlated with input spiking data. So basically what alphas does is alphas trying to infer the firing rate that is correlating to the input spiking data based on the input spiking data. And the tool we are going to use to deploy the model is HL/ML. I think most of us are familiar with this Python package. If you don't, please just grab a Harvard guy. They will explain this package for you. Yep. So basically, it's a Python package that can automatically translate deep learning models to hardware languages that can be used for FPGA deployment. And with that in mind, we further analyzed the alphas architecture here's a model summary. Basically the same thing with the overall figure previously. Yeah, the input will be sent to this encoder RNN, which is a bidirectional GRU. And then it goes to one dense layer to output the mean, one dense layer to output the log var. And those two are going to be sent into the Gaussian sampling layer here to generate Gaussian samples. The Gaussian samples will be then served as the initial state of the decoder GRU, and then two dense layer for factor and log firing rates. So yeah, actually there are some requirements in order to use HRS4ML for the PDA deployment. So the model, for example, the model has to be based on either PyTorch or TensorFlow to carry sequential or functional API, at least at that time. And also all the layers in the model to be implemented in the package. So in our case, there are several technical issues we have to solve. The first is that the alphas is custom model. It's now either based on sequential API or functional API. And also there's a custom layer, the Gaussian sampling layer, and one unsupported Keras layer, the bidirectional layer, and one unsupported arguments or feature, the GRU initial state. And the first thing we did is actually we removed the Gaussian from the alphas, and we make it a separate project, and it is still ongoing. We will add the Gaussian sampling layer back once this project is finished. And we also recreate alphas in Keras functional API. So this is actually the exact model we are currently using for the deployment. The main difference is here. So in the previous slides, we have dense mean and dense log var, but right now we only have mean. So the mean is now served as the initial state for the decoder GRU. Essentially, we are converting the VAE to AE, variational autoencoder to autoencoder. We will definitely check the performance after we remove the Gaussian. So the data set we use is here, a neural population mechanism for rapid learning. And for the testing data set, there are total 17 trials. For each trial, we calculate the metric for evaluation. So the metric we use is negative Poisson log likelihood. This is also the loss function used for training. So minimize during the training, alphas is trying to minimize the negative Poisson likelihood to reach the optimal performance. So basically, lower value means better performance. And the figure here, the blue line shows the original alphas performance, and the orange line here shows the no Gaussian alphas performance. So we can tell there's only slightly, the value of the no Gaussian alphas is slightly higher, which means slightly worse than the original alphas, but still acceptable. For those part, it's pretty much the same, except only this is slightly higher. And then it comes to the HRS4ML implementation. This is also what we did, what we usually do in general if we saw a unsupported layer in HRS4ML in our group. So in my case, the bidirectional GRU is now supported. So I implement that in the HRS4ML. I'll probably not discuss the implementation details here, but I'd like to talk more about that in the poster section. So the bidirectional GRU essentially are two GRUs combined together. So one forward GRU, one backward GRU, and the output can be concatenated. In this case, the bidirectional GRU provide us more details than a unidirectional GRU. And also another thing is we implement a new feature in the existing HRS4ML GRU layer. This is the same GRU layer as Xiaohan mentioned earlier this afternoon. So previously, the initial state or the hidden state of the GRU can only be set to 0. But for alphas, the initial state has to use specific values. So we just add that feature to allow user to set specific values to the HRS4ML GRU initial state. And so, yeah, basically at this point, we solved every technical issue we have. And then we pushed LFAS through HRS4ML and checked the HRS model performance. This is the this is the hardware. This is the HRS model performance with different precision. So basically, at this point, after 8 integer bit or above 8 integer bit and 10 fractional bits, the model performs as the same as the original LFAS. The blue line is the ground truth, the original LFAS performance, or the floating point LFAS performance. And this weird vertical orange line here is because we, at this point, at this data point, the performance is so bad. So it goes so high here. And when I just zoom into this section, we can just see the connections. We can now see the data point here. And comes to the FPGA deployment. So because the current board we are using is the Xilinx U55C. And the precision we choose is 16.6, which means 6 integer bits and 10 fractional bits. So this is actually, for now, after the post-training quantization, this is the lowest precision we can get while maintaining a pretty good performance. Frequency is 200 megahertz. Latency for running one batch of testing data on the FPGA is around 42 microseconds. And the table here shows the FPGA resource utilization. So basically, we just use a quarter of the board roughly. And multi-block RNN autoencoders, MRE, and this has been mentioned several times in the morning talk. This has been developed here in the UDAP by a previous student in Amy's lab and Ali's lab. So this model is actually the one we are going to use for the slip spindle detection. And it is developed based on the LFAS. So we can see here, those are all LFAS-like model, like encoder, latent space, decoder. And this whole model is separated to different sections or different blocks, each block corresponding to different frequencies. And in this case, this model can, when we just separate the frequency to different bands, the model performs much better. And for this example here, I just show one model in each block, but in reality, there are much more models in one block. So then it comes what we are going to do next. So one model in being deployed onto the FPGA, but we are going to have more. Okay, like this. So the thing we need to do is to reduce FPGA resource utilization and trying to increase the throughput in order to deploy the MRE onto FPGA, the large model onto FPGA. And things like quantization, aware training, things like that will be applied to an LFAS model as well, but it's still ongoing. And for my work, the current progress and future work will be add a Gaussian sampling layer back to my model. Then we can convert the 8 back to VAE, and the whole LFAS can be deployed onto FPGA. And we will extend to the MRE. And here basically shows that we are done with the HRS4ML implementation, and models are trained, are tuned pretty good, and we are just working on the optimization. And other related projects in our group is the transformer model for neural signals. So this is very similar to my project, except my project is for RNN variational autoencoder, and this is for the transformer model. So similar project, similar procedure, or similar approach. We will need to tune the model, implement HRS4ML, and to support this transformer model. And as Al have mentioned earlier, we have already finished the implementation of a transformer layer in HRS4ML, but we will still need to add some small features to that layer in order to support this model. And the model for the pure model itself, is already done. We've trained, we've tested, that performs pretty good. And those are the results from this single layer to show this single layer performs pretty good. And another project is the Gaussian sampling in HL4ML. This is very related to my project because this is separate from the alphas. And we are going to, because since this is a custom layer, we are going to use the PR 528 to pull request 528 in HL4ML, which is the extension API that can allow you to register a custom layer in HL4ML. And for the current progress is that we have already finished the HL's code, and we are working on the Python part of the HL4ML. And for this two project, I'm not involved in this two project, but for the benchmarking HL4ML, Verilog is just like the title. Curly and Wise are trying to compare the performance between a HL's design versus a very carefully optimized handwritten version system Verilog based on the same benchmarking data. And Wise will also hold a poster presentation this afternoon. We will be right there next to my poster. Please stop by if you are interested in this project. And also the APU, the algorithm processing unit. This is the same one. This is the same thing as I have mentioned earlier this afternoon. And yeah, that concludes my presentation. And questions?
Right. So questions? Also on Zoom, if there's questions. But okay. So yeah, I just had a quick question about
Sure.
On your project where you said you're using only like a quarter of the FPGA.
Yeah.
I was actually going to ask if there was any plans to like expand what's put on the FPGA, but I think that you had a slide about.
Yeah, so basically the things like so for now it's only for post-training quantization, and another team member in Bochin's group is currently working on the quantization array training. That will save a lot of, that will allow us to use smaller precision while maintaining good performance. And in that case, we can deploy more onto the FPGA, more models onto the FPGA. Yeah.
And do you have an idea of how the resources?
How small it is?
So yeah, how much? That would
I will say for now we are. For now, for the post-training quantization, we are currently using 16.6. And for the current development of the QAT, I will say we can try like maybe 8.2 or even smaller, something like that. Yeah.
Okay. If there are no more questions, then question.
So one more question on the whole multiple models on the deployed on the FPGA. So if you like, perhaps I misunderstood, but these models are architecturally very similar. And do you plan on just having multiple copies of them? Or do you plan to maybe have one that is then reconfigured or using different weights in order to process? So like, is the goal to have to minimize the latency completely by having multiple, like all the models laid out on the board, or to have a single architecture that would then be reused for different aspects of the
So that's that's a very good question. So that's actually the current goal of our project is trying to at this point is trying to lower the latency as much as possible. And but in the meantime, we're also trying to squeezing or we're just using a smaller FPGA that can be used in the head mounted device. So a quick answer would be, I am not sure, but yeah, probably for now, I will say lower the latency.
Okay, no more questions, and let's thank again our speaker. Okay, our next speaker is Shikun.
Hello, everyone. I'm Shikun, and I'm from Professor Panley's group from Georgia Tech EC department. So today's main topic is on the distribution shift problems in scientific domains. So first, a little bit introduction of our group. So our group is called GCOM and led by Professor Panley. The focus of our group is on developing interpretable and generalizable graph machine learning tools for scientific applications. So I'm one of the trainee, and we have another PhD student called Siqi, and he mainly works on the interpretation part. But today, I'm mainly going to focus on the generalizable part. So the content of today's talk is, first I will introduce how distribution shift problems have been widely exist in scientific applications. Then I will introduce one project targeting at a very specific example, pop mitigation task in high energy physics. And then I will introduce our recent paper, a machine learning algorithm on solving the distribution shift problems called structure weight algorithm. Finally, I will cover some future works of our team. So first, as we have heard from many presentations today, we know that graph neural networks have been widely used for scientific applications. I just listed a few examples here. So for the high energy physics task, we can have the path mitigation, which use GNNs, the jet tagging problems. And for the biology fields, we can use GN to predict the protein binding affinity for drug discovery, and also very common molecular property prediction task. These are successful applications of graph neural networks. However, we know that the GNNs suffer from distribution shift problems. So what is the distribution shift? So it's a pretty straightforward idea, actually. So it's just the problem where we have the training data and the testing data distribution are different. So that causes our training model cannot generalize to the testing phase. So how that being widely seen in many scientific applications. So for example, in many experimental settings, it's very time consuming and high cost to obtain the real experimental data. So most of the time we use some synthetic data for training. However, there can be some shift across the synthetic to, across the synthetic to the real data sets. And also it's very hard to control every factors of the data obtained for the training and testing. So for instance, we may have the training data obtained in some period, but the testing data obtained in another time period. Also, the experimental setting difference can cause the shift in distribution, right? Like the experiments are done in different locations under different environments, inject different noises to the data. And the final one example can be the measurement standards different. So for example, in one material science application, we use different measurement standards to get our ground truth values. So that also considered as a distribution shift. And the third category of this kind of shift of this kind of shift requires like task-specific generalization. So what do I mean by some task-specific generalization that's required in some applications? I will list 2 examples here. So the first one is the molecular property prediction. If you can observe, most of the time we predict the property based on one key motif from the molecule. However, the other motif in the molecules may shift across different data. Then we don't want the model to fail if like the other parts of the molecule shift, right? So this required the model to generalize well, even though the entire distribution of the molecules are different. Then the second example can be from the high energy physics, the signal detecting task. So here the signal of interest is tau 2, 3 mu data, and we want to identify if there is a signal other than the pop background noises. However, suppose we have the training data for the tau 2, 3 mu signals, but the testing data are from the D2 mu signals. We also want our model to generalize well in the sense that we can learn there is a signal event, no matter what the actual signals are. Then I will cover a very detailed example in pop mitigation tasks and how we handle that. So this work is called semi-supervised graph neural networks for pop noise removal. And this is a joint work from like students in Purdue, professors in Purdue, and also domain scientists from Fermilab. So many of you may have been familiar with the pop mitigation task. So basically we have proton collisions in the middle of the Large Hadron Collider, which induce 2 kind of interactions. The leading vertex, called leading vertex, the LV, and the pop interactions, PU. So the leading vertex is the signal of interest from the primary interactions, but the pop are additional interactions in the same or nearby crossings. Since the pop are some background noises, which will hurt the reconstruction of some meaningful physics observables. So the task is basically you want to identify whether a particle is from the leading vertex or pile up. Then we want to remove those pile up noises. However, in the reality, we may encounter some challenges in the detectors. So the particles can be divided into 2 types, the charged particles and neutral particles. However, since the detector can only retrieve the hits for the charged particles, so it's easy to retrieve the labels for the charged particles, but there is no ground truth label for neutral particles. The way we handle this is to let the model train on the charged particles with their given labels and then infer on the unlabeled neutral particles. And I remember like someone asked whether why we use a graph-based semi-supervised for that. So it's basically for the semi-supervised learning, we want to utilize the unlabeled features also. And the graph structure can both utilize the charge labels in the neighborhoods and also use the neutral particles features naturally by the graph structure. And also like answered by Jack, the power particles are surrounded by power particles, leading vertex are surrounded by leading vertex. So this problem fits very well with the graph-based semi-supervised framework. However, as we introduced before, we noticed that the training is on the charge, but the testing is on the neutrals. So the distribution shift occurs. Then how we handle that, we just adopt a very intuitive approach. So the intuition here is to make the training charge particles look like the testing neutral particles, which introduce our approach here is called masking strategy. Suppose the features for the particles can be divided into 2 parts. The first part are features that are shared across the charged and neutral particles. The second part is the specific features for the charged and the specific features for the neutral particles. So they are unshared. And our strategy is to mask those unshared features. I will not cover too much details on this projects. Like, I think I have introduced that in the last meeting. So if you are interested in the more details about this, you can check our paper or come to me for more details. However, the masking strategy, the way we handle the distribution shift problem in this PUB mitigation project is like very simple. And in practice, many assumptions may violate, or we may encounter more complex situations. For example, we assume the shared features have same distribution to enable the model of generalization. However, in practice, the shared features may exhibit different distributions. And also you notice that we only handle the no feature shift, right? But in reality, there may be additional graph structure shift here. And also, in addition to the generalization from the charged to neutral particles, we can have more like additional cases where we need model generalization. For example, the common synthetic to real data set setting, and also the number of PUB interactions may vary from training to testing data. So we have shift across different PUB levels. And then there's a potential shift with particles within different locations of detectors. So that's also one case where we may encounter some shift. So this motivates us to have a more principled and general methodology to handle this problem. So this comes to our recent algorithm called structure weight algorithm, which is also a joint work with domain scientists from Fermilab and professor from UIUC, professor from Purdue. It's called structure reweighting improves graph domain adaptation. So before introduce the detail of our methodology, we formalize some ideas in this field. So I talk a lot about distribution shift. However, to handle distribution shift, there are two categories of algorithm. One is called out of distribution generalization, which we denote as OD, and one is called domain adaptation, which we denote as DA. The key difference between these two categories of algorithm is the level of information we got from target. So for the OD task, we have no access to target or testing data, you can imagine. And for the DA task, we have access to target data, and they share the similar goal is we want the model to generalize well to target data, right? And our following algorithm focused on the case for unsupervised domain adaptation, where we have the access to target features, but no label information, which is a very common scenarios we may encounter in real applications. And the mathematical formulation of the problem is the joint distribution of feature and label across source and target domain are different. Like the source you can think about as training data, and the target you can think about as testing data. So the joint distribution are different. Then given the joint distribution difference, it can be categorized into different assumptions. Like for example, the shift may be encountered in the marginal feature distribution. Okay, let's look at this side. So the feature, there may be a shift encountered in the marginal feature distribution, but the conditional distribution of y given x is the same, or otherwise we have different label distribution, but the conditional distribution of x given y is different. Or we can have different conditional distribution, but we don't have any constraint on whether the label have shift or not. And some common methodologies regarding domain adaptation is to learn the invariant representations, which we call invariant representation learning. Just from the input features, we have the encoder that achieves the output latent representations to be invariant across the source and target domain. And naturally, if we extend this idea to the graph structure data, it's very simple. You can just imagine we have the invariant latent representation after the GN encoder on the graph on the node representations, right? However, the only difference is we also have the graph structure in addition to the node features. So the encoder taking the graph structure, which we can use as the adjacency matrix and the node features together for the latent representation. However, our work have proved the suboptimality of invariant representation learning in graph domain adaptation. The actual problem here is, even though we have the invariant latent representation, there can be a shift in terms of the conditional graph structure. So what do I mean by that? So if we look at this graph here, the green circle indicate the neighborhood distribution, right? And the gray one is the center node. We want to predict the label. And we notice the neighborhood ratio, like the other collisions, which is the pop, and linear collision, it's LV. Like the neighborhood distribution is the same, but indeed the central node ground truths are different. So, which means there is a shift across the conditional structure, which means given a node, suppose the node is linear vertex, its neighborhood can be different across different pop levels. So that's the problem we encounter as conditional structure shift. And our structure weight algorithm targets at handling this issue. And here I'm gonna briefly introduce what's graph neural network. And so we have several layers for the GN encoder, and for each layer, for a center node, we basically conduct 2 steps. First, we so we all know that for each node we can have a representation, right? And for each layer, the center node will gather the representations from its neighborhood and then update for the center node's representations. And after all GN layers, we got the node representations for the downstreaming prediction task. And if we are focusing on the graph level task, we just pull every vertex, pull the representations for every nodes together to get the graph representations. And here, our structure weight algorithm, we can consider the one layer message passing of the graph neural network as aggregating neighborhood representation into a multiset. So here for the source graph, the center node have a multiset which it contains like the representation, for example, the class 0 representations, the class 1 representations. Also, the target graph will have lists of multisets as that. And since the neighborhood distribution are different, it can be reflected in different cardinality and distribution of elements in those multisets. You can imagine, for example, a zero class node in the source graph will have 2 0 class surrounded and one class surrounded, and the target graph 0 class node will have like 3 0 class nodes surrounded and one class node surrounded. So that's the neighborhood different, and it will reflect it in the cardinality of those 0 class representations and 1 class representations. So in order to align or match those multi-set distribution across the source and target, our goal is to downsample or resample the elements. So as my simple example, the 3-to-1 ratio and 2-to-1 ratio basically want to upsample the 2-to-1 to 3-to-1 or downsample the 3-to-1 to 2-to-1. That's the basic idea. And then in practice, this sampling procedure can be transformed into edge weights. And why? So the graph structure here we can describe as the edge connection probability, where the cases we have k classes, we have the edge connection probability matrix by with dimension k by k, and each element indicating the edge connecting probability from a node I class to a node J class, class I node to a class J node, sorry. And for a class I node, its multiset will contain n times the edge connecting probability of ij, many class J attributes. And also we know the GN pooling layer, GN has pooling layers to aggregate those information in multisets. So the sampling process can be transformed as edge weights from to add it to the source graph, and the edge weight from the class J nodes to the class I node is just the ratio of the edge connection probability. So, and this edge connection probability can be approximated by the labels from the source graphs and the pseudo labels from target graphs, since our problem don't have the labels for target. And then we also introduce a hyperparameter to control how much we rely on this edge weights. And the overall pipeline is just like this. We first do the structured reweighting module before on the source graph, and then input the reweighted source graph and target graph for the GN encoder. We did some experiments on the synthetic and some real data sets. So for the synthetic data sets, as our expected, we observed some performance decreases with the increase in the conditional structure shift, which from the right of the table to the left of the table. And also we observe our structure-based model significantly outperform those baselines, especially under the case we have more severe conditional structure shift. And also we did some experiments on the high-energy physics datasets. Particularly the shift here we use is the pulp conditions. So it's for example, the training is on 30 and the testing is on 10, or the training is on 10, testing is on 30. And also the second shift is the physical process shifts across the training and testing. And also here, the conclusion is the structure weight-based models still perform better than the baselines. However, you tend to wonder there's a smaller gap. But our explanation for the smaller gap is due to the physics task itself being a binary classification task, which caused the decision boundary to be simple. So the performance decay may be smaller. And also it's a multi-graph training and testing process. So the edge reweighting process, edge reweighting effect may be averaged over like multiple graphs for the training and testing. Finally, some future works in our group. So regarding the scientific application part, we currently are extending the pulp mitigation project to more real data setting. And we are currently trying with some domain adaptation techniques, which Jack introduced. And also we are seeking for more applications that can you guys hear me? So we are seeking for more applications that exist distributional shift. So if you have encountered like similar problems in your projects, feel free to, we are very welcome to discuss the problem with you guys. And for the distributional shift, we are going to elaborate on our structure weight project with more general assumptions and more algorithm designs. And also a current project going on is we have an OOD benchmark project on various scientific applications, including high-energy physics, biology, and material science. So today we know that distribution shifts are critical problems in distribution shifts problem are critical in scientific domain, and we have proposed series of work to handle that, including the masking in pulp mitigation project and a more principal structure weight algorithm. So if you're interested in our work, like the paper, also the paper and code for the structure weighting project are online. So feel free to check them out. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, questions?
Is this one on? I'm curious on how significant a difference in the two distributions between the target and the test you can sort of correct for, particularly if one is maybe, you know, some form of multi-dimensional Gaussian and the other maybe a more general heavy tail distribution?
So we didn't like particularly focus on like if one distribution is Gaussian or one is heavy tail, like this kind of specific type of distribution shift. But generally you can imagine if the shift is too large, it will not generalize, right? Yeah. So so basically so assumption here is basically it's somehow related or somehow similar, but actually have some difference. But if like it's completely different, then it will not work. Yeah.
Okay. Other questions?
Do you, so maybe I'm not quite understanding this, but do you need to know like when you do this reweighting, do you need to know say the variable or variables of interest that are different between the two graphs? Like, or do you not, do you just run it and it determines which of any of all the possible sort of variables in the representation are different between the two graphs, and then it reweights them all?
Okay, so your question is basically you may have some graph that does not have distribution shift, but some graph have distribution shift, and you don't know which one have and which one have not, right? Like,
yeah, or you're not sure which variables there may be distribution shift in or severe distribution shift in.
Oh, okay. So regarding this, it's actually we don't need to know exact like type of distribution shift, or for example, like actually you don't need to know if there is a shift in pop level or a shift in signal. You just have an input of the source graph and target graph, and then you apply the algorithm. But our algorithm, there is a way you can like calculate the conditional structure shift between like the source and target. And yeah, so basically you don't need to know exactly the distribution or not. You can just like simply input those graphs into the algorithm. Yeah, and our final goal is like we have generalized well to the set of potentially shifted target graph. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So let's thank our speaker again.